Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Paul Conrad, and I'm an associate professor in the history department here at the University of Texas at Arlington. I wanted to welcome all of you to this, the 21st Annual Transatlantic History Conference. This year's theme is Spectacle and Power in the Transatlantic World. So with that in mind, and on behalf of the history department here at UT Arlington, I want to again welcome all of you to this, the 21st Annual Transatlantic History Conference. We're looking forward to your presentations and engaging with them and learning more about all of your work. Thanks again.
The Tiger crept out of the Scottish port Leith, most likely in the dead of night. The ship's captain was keenly aware that the voyage ahead would be arduous, dangerous, and quite possibly his and his crew's final act alive. But the Gold Coast beckoned. He could not shake the temptation of lucrative profits that others were making out of Africa.
American colonists did not live in isolation, free from the entanglements of their wider world. Indeed, colonists eagerly gobbled up the latest British imports, both literally and figuratively. In fact, by mid-century, the colonists were the largest overseas market for British goods and consumed more tea per capita than the inhabitants of England.
Silver raids on Molly houses occurred in the 1720s, the most famous being the 1726 raid on Margaret Clapp's house in Holborn. A report states, on a Sunday night in February 1726, a squadron of police constables converged upon the Molly house. All the avenues escaped being blocked. By the early morning hours, the rooms had been emptied of 40 sodomitical men, who were rounded up and hauled off to Newgate Prison to await trial.
And while the Baptist Rebellion has received little attention from most historians in and of itself, the Maroon importance during this conflict has been especially understated. Yet Maroons were integral to squashing the Baptist Rebellion.
So I will pass things now over then to the chair of this panel, Dr. Lydia Towns. Thank you, Lydia.
All right, thank you, William. And thank you to everybody for your papers and for attending today's presentations. This panel was really very good. It was quite exciting.
But I do think the volumes that are being published and republished kind of indicate the ubiquity of the cookbooks. And what's really interesting, and this is kind of further down the line, is looking at how British cookbooks kind of became or set a precedence for American cookbooks.
Dr. Towns, first of all, thank you so much for your really helpful comments, really kind and thought-provoking. Caribbean newspapers are one of the main types of sources that I work with, and it's not uncommon to see Maroons being praised for utility, while also about being denigrated the next paragraph for living arrangements, for agricultural practices, for language.
What could be shipped in obviously dictated what they could actually make. So that might actually give a little bit of guidelines or parentheses around what sort of recipes could actually be created at all, and seeing how that might change with influxes of new products, new commodities, and different time periods. And so if those, if you could graph it maybe and see if there's spikes, and
Question for you was whether or not you had seen any correlation between what's going on in London and the sodomy laws within the maritime community.
Not really, actually. A lot of this be just because it's based on what evidence was being uncovered. I did see a few one-line sentences in other newspapers that said, young man or young boy off of this ship from another country was arrested, for something. But then that would be it.
Teddy Roosevelt wrote the introduction to that book and was convinced by its record as well. He said, "The man who reads Kellogg's sketch and yet fails to see why we are at war and why we must accept no peace save that of overwhelming victory is neither a good American nor a true lover of mankind."
Through spectacles of culture at U.S. pavilions during their first decade of participation at the Zagreb Fair, government officials in charge successfully conveyed an attractive representation of people's capitalism. However, American businesses' prospects of tenable Yugoslav trade partners were predominantly unfruitful.
Exposing tens of thousands of workers in a factory which rarely shut down, to near constant lead paint fumes likely did more harm than graying or discolored walls ever could do to their workman's ethic.
These papers are insightful and provocative, and I very much look forward to discussing your research in greater detail.
He would spend hours and hours on the campaign trail. He actually invented the whistle stop tour. And on many of these stops, he would talk to people that came up to his train or wherever he was speaking, and really did understand to an extent that I think we find difficult to believe today, but he really did seem to understand the people and identify with them.
So the United States saw an opportunity to stick their foot in the door, open up these trade markets, and display to these other nations that just because you're communist doesn't mean that you don't have to have these trade relations with the West. We can still help you out while you're helping us, of course.
One of the reasons why we see these brochures taking so much time to walk through every element of the production process is to sort of reassure consumers, hey, you should buy our car that's very carefully designed. And we look at all this time and effort we put into this and how it's this massive orchestra of industry, and we're so careful with putting everything together. You don't really want to go down the street and buy Joe Smith's starters and light bulbs. You want to buy ours because we're doing everything properly.
Thank you all so very, very much for this. It was absolutely fantastic. It was such a pleasure meeting you virtually, and your scholarship, I have no doubt I will be looking forward to introducing other people to it in the future.
Thanks for moderating. You did a great job. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Good evening. I'm Brenda McClurkin. I'm Department Head in Special Collections and Archives, and
I'm Ben Huseman, the cartographic archivist here.
We want to welcome you to Special Collections. And one is this beautiful pocket watch, and it's a Braille pocket watch. When you open the cover, there's no glass over the numbers, and each one of those numbers has a little knob. So by feeling where the hands of the watch are and where the knobs are as relationship to this, he could tell what time it was. Also attached to it, interestingly, are one of his dog tags from World War II.
This is a Lynn Schoten map of Africa based on Portuguese information. Lynn Schoten was the assistant to, or secretary to, the Archbishop of Goa from Portugal, and as he was returning from Portugal, or from Goa, Lynn Schoten took extensive notes because his country was at war suddenly with Portugal, and they were able to steal all this Portuguese information, and the Dutch, he became sort of a pathfinder to the east as a result of his espionage with the Portuguese. So this is pretty amazing stuff. We haven't.
If ever as dramatic as all that. Red lighting was a very real and very concerning practice. From the early decades of the American circus, shows large enough to have any meaningful division of labor routinely abandoned employees and animals whenever finances began to run short, or at least refused to pay a salary to those laborers they considered unskilled and replaceable.
His conclusions from studying the sarcophagus found there reveal what sort of thought went into 19th century archaeology. Salt described it as, quote, a superb sarcophagus of dark-colored granite, highly polished and having a single band of hieroglyphics encircling it. The shape of the sarcophagus answers precisely to the usual form of the mummy cases and proves very clearly that the bodies were laid horizontally, end quote. Based on this and another sarcophagus found at the site, Salt claimed that the spot was likely the location of an ancient temple of Minerva, where the tombs of ancient kings were found.
Dave Brubeck was a very patriotic individual. Not only patriotic, as one would expect of his generation, he was also very much a humanitarian. For Mr. Brubeck, the prospect of touring under the auspices of the U.S. State Department were not so much a national thing, a patriotic thing, as a way to express what he considered to be a truly American art form, music in which every instrumentalist and vocalist, indeed, even a drummer, has an opportunity to contribute something and even shine at times in order to produce a unitary piece of art.
I'm Paul Ruiz. I'm the Vice President of THSO. Those were wonderful presentations by Coit, Mike, and William. Dan, take it away.
All right. I don't know why, Paul. You were doing a great job. You already had all the points down and everything. Yes, I am Dan Deggs. I am a graduate of the PhD program, no longer a student at UTA. But there's a book that actually was kind of dancing, or you made me think about something, because I actually knew about something of the idea of this guy did a book called Horrible Pretty Prettiness, Burlesque in American Culture.
I haven't read it.
Well, because that kind of moves us out of the idea of mass media and print and into the idea of the entertainment world with the singularity that it was a spectacle that people could look at as different, while at the same time making it an integral part of the American nationalism.
The connection between entertainment and imperialism at that time, and art in general and imperialism, is very strong, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. It's sort of a key part of driving empire.
It'll get more into that, but I also want to look at the ways that British citizens reacted to these things, maybe through like newspapers or periodicals responding to what they would see in the British Museum. I want to get outside just the government men and look at how other people saw these things.
Conductor, musicologist, and author Rick Benjamin has built his exciting and one-of-a-kind career through the discovery and performance of historic American music. He has lectured at more than 100 universities, and his historic recreations have been heard in productions by the Walt Disney Company, the BBC, NPR, PBS, HBO, Turner Classic Movies, FX for American Horror Story, and more.
These earliest exhibits of moving pictures, once you could throw something onto a screen and sell tickets to an audience, were the earliest ways that folks could experience this as a communal event. And the films were shown absolutely silently. And the entire hook, the entire interest was the technology itself. That here for the first time in human history was an image that actually moved. And this would go out by the thousands to every cinema that was going to run this picture. So it gives you your action cue over here, what's happening, another action cue, or a title cue over here, what that title card, when it flashes on the screen, it tells you what piece of music you're supposed to be playing, how many minutes and seconds over here, and then gives you the actual snippet of the melody showing you where within this composition you're supposed to start. And exhibitors were competing with each other for audience share by building ever larger and ever more luxurious theaters. And they became known as movie palaces. I love this cartoon. This is an old New Yorker cartoon from 1929. The little girl goes into one of these places and says, "Mama, does God live here?" So the microphone comes along with related electrical recording and amplification equipment. The following year, 1926, Warner Brothers developed something called the Vitaphone, which was sound on disc, synchronizing records to go with the moving pictures, the thing. And this was disastrous, of course, for musicians. As I said, there were about 100,000 people involved, and suddenly they're not. One of these guys was my grandfather, too, who was a violinist in the movie theater. And, he went from that to being a teller in a bank. So his entire world changed.
It is of some interest that while Havana had 43 Inquisition trials, Santo Domingo, where the Audiencia was based, only had 9. This should not indicate that Havana was some morally bankrupt city, but rather that the residents were more likely to report unorthodox activity.
The problem with the concept of disenchantment is its Orientalist roots and tendencies. Al-Assad, in its insightful and scathing critique of secularism, argues for looking beyond mere binaries, the division between modern, non-modern, West, non-West.
So Scott is choosing in many ways he doesn't want to reanimate or play out how the revolt ultimately ended in the massacre of Black life, but he's instead proposing an alternate ending. What if things had gone differently? What if the 1811 uprising had succeeded and there had been an African republic that was established in Louisiana? What would that have done to the course of United States history?
Although Porras envisioned the exposition as a
locus of entertainment like Goodhue did, he above all sought to provide a lasting culture commemoration that would last. Instead of creating temporary buildings, Porras's Barrio de la Fusión left a whole neighborhood to coming generations.
Of course, I'm Erhard van Deventer from the University of Texas at Arlington, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here today to discuss this panel.
The Protestant Reformation sort of put Spain in this position where they were the ones who were enforcing religious orthodoxy. So the Inquisition comes out of that arm.
Yeah.
And we see that into the Iberian Peninsula, but we also see it as well into the colonial enterprise.
And I think works such as Dred Scott's Rebellion in this case, it brings attention, right? It brings that past into the present and kind of disrupts the linear time that Western narratives so, rely on so heavily. And there are multiple, I watched a lot of different videos of the presentation, and they actually speak to people.
With affection, and again, as a real monument to their own entrance separate from the U.S. into the 20th century, and as a symbol of that progress. So I think it really is, again, a manner of beyond just the physicality, but it's tied deeply with these practices of remembering and forgetting selectively.
But a conflict of identity can be seen in migrants from Ireland to the United States. They leave the country with their identity as an Irish citizen, but along their journey to the new country, their identity adapts to their experience and it takes on this transnational perspective.
La Prensa began as a weekly publication printing on Thursdays that was aimed at Mexicans living in exile in San Antonio, Texas, but its growing success allowed it to go into daily publication as soon as 1914.
When two men were brutally beaten by employees on October 5, 1901, Commissioner Thomas Fitchie dismissed their complaints. The assistant inspector reported 3 other similar incidents to Fitchie, but was told that he was observing too many things.
I'm Dr. Malinka Kilgore-Cardona. I am a professor at Texas A&M University Commerce. I am also an alum of the Transatlantic, or now History program at UT Arlington. So I was really honored that William asked me to come back as an alum. There's a lot of commonality here. All 3 papers are looking at immigrants, right? And looking at identity of immigrants and how immigration affects national identity.
We see a lot of firsthand views of what their mother went through, having been born in Limerick and then returning to Limerick after being gone in America for several years.
So they would highlight the way that that Mexico is this sort of multiracial nation and how everyone is treated equally as a Mexican citizen.
There were an awful lot of cases of male immigrants where physical violence was just rampant in Ellis Island. And I think that speaks to the white American, the idea of white American masculinity and how foreign-born men were viewed as, they were looked down upon and viewed as a threat.
I've read medical texts that discuss medical experiments done on Irish immigrant women because they weren't perceived as being white. They were placed into the same category as African-American women in the United States often were, as being, that more masculine, having a higher pain tolerance.
Thank you, everybody. This was a really great panel. I enjoyed all of the papers. I thank everyone who participated in both, obviously in the panel and in our audiences as well.
Our keynote speaker tonight is Dr. Jeremy M. Johnston from the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. He serves as the Hal and Naomi Tate Endowed Chair of Western History, the Goppert Curator of the Buffalo Bill Museum, and the Managing Editor of the Papers of William F. Cody.
So today I'm going to talk about the Wild West side of American existence, Buffalo Bill, Theodore Roosevelt, and the spectacle and power of the Rough Riders. So what Europeans were seeing is basically the history of the American West reenacted by real frontiersmen and Lakota warriors. So, for example, when they were watching the reenactment of the Last Stand, Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of the Little Bighorn, they were watching many Lakota warriors who actually fought that day of the battle. 1900, he became the Vice President of the United States because the machine politicians wanted him out of the way. After McKinley was assassinated in 1901, I think Mark Hanna summed it up nicely. He said, now that damned cowboy is president. Although World War I challenged the effectiveness of the Rough Rider idea, it still resonates in Europe and the United States. A lasting legacy of Buffalo Bill and Theodore Roosevelt, whose Rough Rider imagery combines spectacle and power to promulgate American exceptionalism on a transnational stage. And the other side of it, too, is in some countries, Buffalo Bill was forced to change up the acts because people didn't want to see the Lakota people being defeated, the Lakota or the Cheyenne being defeated, especially in Germany. American Indians were the first separate race to be brought into the mainstream American military. It scared the hell out of the Germans because the Germans all panicked. In fact, the high command tried to keep this secret, but the Germans were afraid when the word got out that Winnetou was going to sneak across no man's land, get into the trenches, and scalp all the Germans. We cannot separate this idea that everything is dramatic. You know, everything has to be in black and white. There's no shades of gray. There's always heroes and there's always villains. And Buffalo Bill did that with the Indian Wars. Roosevelt did it with the American military. Okay, we've lost those nuances of the past. We lost the nuances of current political debates because we like the guys in the black hats and the guys in the white hats. We like to be able to think that right will always prevail over might, and it just doesn't always happen that way.
We've had a lovely gathering of people who all really stepped up to the plate. Everyone really met the challenge of finding ways to consider these questions of spectacle and of power and how they intersect, right? And I was really impressed with everyone's work and how well these panels went and how well everyone interacted in them and found ways to connect their work to each other. You know, with COVID, we decided to make it virtual, and then the world was opening back up, and we thought maybe we should have made it in person. It ended up staying virtual, and I'm kind of glad it stayed that way. For all the disadvantages and problems with that, we ended up having some really special moments that were only possible because this was virtual. So I'm really, really thrilled with how this conference turned out.